Hi, my name is Norm Goos. I am in the Colonel Richard Summers chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution, the New Jersey Society, and I'd like to tell you about a Revolutionary War battle that occurred at Chestnut Neck, New Jersey. First of all, I'd like to tell you where Chestnut Neck is. Chestnut Neck is at Little Egg Harbor Inlet. It's in the Mullica River, about 7 or 8 miles in from the ocean, and it's right where the Garden State Parkway Bridge currently goes over the Mullica River. That's where most of our action is going to be located today. And so, as I move forward, this is a shot of a painting that was done probably 70 years ago by John Wanamaker's in Philadelphia depicting the battle. And this is just a small section of it. If you'd like to see the entire painting, which is about 30 feet long, you can go to the Port Republic, New Jersey City Hall and see it mounted in their council room. But let's get to our next slide. Here's a picture of the Mullica River. Now, here's the logistics, the geography. There is an inlet today called Little Egg Harbor Inlet on the New Jersey coast. And inside that inlet is a large bay, probably about 5 miles across. And that's called Great Bay because of its size. That, in the back end of it, is where the Mullica River empties. The Mullica River starts all the way up near Rancocas, New Jersey. And when it comes down near Chestnut Neck, it has a serpentine effect to it. And Chestnut Neck is on one of the bends. So as we're thinking, let's go to the Revolutionary War time. You know, if you look at the screen in 1773, the Boston Tea Party occurred. And we won't give a lot of detail. But you know, again, 2 years later in 1775, we have the battles of Lexington and Concord. And then the patriots in those two towns, the militia, if you want to call them that, chased the British all the way back to Boston. And Boston was blockaded by volunteers, the British being in town, the volunteers circling. Well, as we go on, some things started happening in New Jersey. The British had a lot of troops up in Boston and a lot of ships, and they had to feed those soldiers and sailors. They couldn't feed them in that area because every time they'd try to go on the land, they'd be attacked by the different militia and armed units. So what they did is they sailed south. And the only place they could find cattle for meat was on the cattle ranches, the summer ranches that were comprised of the barrier islands in southern New Jersey. So they would come down here and they would steal cows. The New Jersey farmers immediately started the Egg Harbor Guard to protect the islands. And then these farmers found a new method of earning money. They would lure the British ships into the sand shoals on the beaches. The British supply ships would get caught. The farmers would take off all the material that they could and ship it up to Washington's army. And the sailors would be traded off with the British for Americans that were captured during the conflict. And this slide simply talks about the fact that this privateering, as it was called, or legalized privacy, was allowed by the United States Congress in its beginnings. And the battalion started taking ships, the first one being the Rebecca and Francis. At the same time, they realized they were going to have to protect the fort that they built at the inlet. Now, remember I said there's Little Egg Harbor Inlet. Well, the Little Egg Harbor Inlet that we know today was not there in the 1770s. It was 5 miles north of there, and it was still called by the same name. Right inside that inlet, when you reached the marshes, was a large island, and that island was called Foxborough, presumably because there were families of fox living on it. The early militia built a fort out of logs and mud there. And they simply called the fort the Mud Fort in Foxborough. And initially they had some small cannon there to try to protect against the British coming in and raiding the various farms and salt works and things like that in the area. And many of the soldiers that were in these units later on in the 1830s, when they applied for pensions, talked about building these forts as early as mid to late 1775, and certainly built them very well in 1776. So they built this fort out on Foxborough Island, and that protected the inlet itself. But back at Chestnut Neck, realizing that the British could come in the inlet eventually and attack that, they built a fort there right on the river where they could shoot any ships coming in, and then another fort on a hill behind it where they could lob mortars onto the ships coming down the river. You say, well, why would they do that? Think about the privateers and the ships that they were snatching from the British, the supply ships. They would bring them into the harbor, get them to just where it was shallow water. If the ship was small enough, they'd wait for high tide and sail it back to Chestnut Neck. If the ship was too big, they'd unload it onto smaller boats, and then they'd send the ship back out all the way to Philadelphia to be used as an American supply ship, privateer ship, or warship. So Chestnut Neck was a big deal in this particular time, and they needed to protect it. They kept on snatching ships throughout 75 and 76. Several more were collected on the beach, and there's a cute story, and it's told enough times that we're pretty sure it's true. What the soldiers would do is they'd take out in their rowboats, their sailboats, a couple of mules to the island, and they would strap the mules together as if they were pulling a wagon. And what they do is they put something on the mule's back, a board, and on top of the board they'd put a large lantern that would be fueled by whale oil. They'd now walk the mule in a long oval shape. Now, 4 or 5 miles out to sea, that looked like a lighthouse turning. And so the British supply ships would think they had reached an inlet, and they'd come charging in at full steam, only to run right up on the sandbar, and the Egg Harbor Guard, the militia, would be there waiting to arrest the sailors, take all the food and ammunition and materials off, and they would get a piece of the action as it was sold or shipped to George Washington to supply his troops. And again, the ships were used for other purposes. This started really bothering the British. Now, the British started doing things to try to get back at them. They started raids. And since the county north of us, what we call Ocean County today, was populated mainly by British loyalists, those people would come down and try to burn a house or retake a ship, those kind of things. At one time, in 1777, we're told that the people from here, the militia from here, went up to New Gretna in that area and tried to clear out these loyalists, but the loyalists were too powerful for them. Another time, in 1777, they saw 3 British ships out in the middle of Great Bay. And so they ran to today's Leeds Point, and they set up 2 small cannon and a small mortar. And they attacked those ships. And they had gotten so good at their cannon and mortar aim that they were able to sink one of them. And in 1832, when the Pension Act was passed, and these folks gave their affidavits before the court, they said that the wreckage of that ship was still laying out in Great Bay. It's not there today. Time and water has taken care of that. Well, after that, in 1778, the British attacked a little town called Absecon. And when that occurred, they were there to burn houses and burn salt works. But the militia was called up, and the militia beat the British there, took about 30 prisoners, and as far as we now can tell from a brand new pension application from a man named Bates that lived outside of Hamilton, that about 30 of the British that came were killed there. And so that's kind of an interesting story of a second battle that was fought in Atlantic County that we just learned about today as I'm recording this. Well, we get back to the Battle of Chestnut Neck. What's going to cause the British to come all the way down from New York and do battle for a little town with only 13 buildings? Doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Well, yes, it does. If we think of the straw that broke the camel's back, that proverb, I'd like to describe 18 straws that broke the British camel's back. And the reason they broke the British camel's back, if we take 1775, when the war really starts, and now we come to 1778, 3 years later, the British papers tell us that insurance to ship supplies to the New World had tripled because these ships were being taken by the privateers, confiscated, if you will, and sold to fund the American War for Independence. And on this slide, you're seeing quite a few ships. You're seeing that in July, 10 ships were sold at Richard Rescott's house in Mays Landing. They were sold off, not only the ships, but their cargo, and their crews were taken prisoner. We get to September, early September, and there are 4 more ships, British ships, taken and sold at Chestnut Neck. And then finally, 4 more ships later in September are taken to Mays Landing, and they are sold. So these 18 ships within about a 45-day period are the 18 straws that broke the camel's back and caused the British in London to tell their generals here in New York City, you need to go down there to Chestnut Neck and you need to clean out that nest of rebel pirates. Their exact words for describing the American patriots in this county. Well, how many were there British coming? Well, we're going to see that there were almost 1,700 Army personnel, plus the Navy personnel, and 13 ships. That's an awful lot. But you see, in those days, George Washington had great spies, and so did the British. So in fact, there were no secrets. Everybody knew what the other side was going to do, and by fast horses, the news spread quickly. So what happens? The British now know that the Americans are getting ready for them. Colonel Summers, the local commanding officer of what we call the 3rd Gloucester Battalion, Summers Battalion, the Egg Harbor Guard, whichever name you choose, realized that a war was coming to his area. So he immediately began to collect together supplies, ammunition, clothing that would wear out quickly, and food. The piece of paper that you see before you is a bill where Colonel Summers was buying enough ammunition to defend Chestnut Neck. Now, let's get back to the story itself. In Britain, prices were going sky high. Let's talk about English-speaking people. You know, we English-speaking people don't like prolonged wars. The British didn't like it. In America, think what happened when the Vietnam War stretched out. Think what happened when the wars in Iraq stretched out. The public complained, the merchants complained, prices were going up, and it put pressure on the politicians to stop the war. Well, that's exactly what was happening in 1778 in London. The British Parliament was under pressure to stop this American war. It was costing too much money. And so their idea was, if we could stop the American supply of extra materials, we could stop the war. Where did the extra materials come from? Chestnut Neck was the largest privateering port between Boston, Massachusetts, and Charleston, South Carolina. It was a major place where the privateers unloaded their captured ships and sold them. And so the British Admiralty said, attack Chestnut Neck, get rid of that nest of rebel pirates. And the people in New York, the generals said, well, here's what we propose to do. We propose to take this group of ships, 13, a couple of large ones, and the rest small, because we're going to have to get through the inlet and get through the bay. We'll take 1,690 troops and we'll go down there. But there's a problem. Now, I want you to look at my hands. Here is Chestnut Neck. Here is New York City. Now, let me move my left hand up a little. Here above New York City is George Washington. The British do not want George Washington to be able to get loose from where he is around Bear Mountain and come all the way down to outside of Atlantic City in order to defend Chestnut Neck. So what they did is they took their best general, Cornwallis, and they sent him into New Jersey with thousands of troops to build a wall of armament so Washington could not come down and rescue Chestnut Neck. So instead of just 1,690 troops, another 4,000, 5,000, or 6,000 were used to stop Washington from helping. Well, that's kind of an amazing thing. So the word got out. The British are coming.
We're leaving.
What happens? In Philadelphia, Benedict Arnold sends troops to defend. In Trenton, Count Pulaski is sent with hundreds of troops to defend. There's an Army colonel, a Virginia Army colonel named Thomas Proctor, who's in Haddonfield, New Jersey, recovering from a wound. He's sent down to see what can be done to defend Chestnut Neck. He gets here, he goes to Chestnut Neck, he meets Major George Payne, and they go out in probably a sail and rowboat out to the island of Foxborough, and they reconnoiter the inlet. All of a sudden, the next day, British troops show up in the ocean outside the inlet, and they started struggling for 24 hours to get in. At this point, Payne and the colonel, Virginia colonel, come in and get back in their boat and come all the way back to Chestnut Neck. Payne writes a letter to Summers that says, activate the militia. Proctor heads up to Haddonfield to get reinforcements and cannon because he's an artillery commander. And so that's what happens in this particular thing. Generals are writing to generals all the way to Washington saying, Egg Harbor, Little Egg Harbor, the breadbasket for Washington's troops on many days, is going to be attacked. Well, even Benedict Arnold, as I said before he turned to be a bad guy, he got involved and sent a couple of hundred troops down to try to solve the problem. This right here is the letter, by the way, that Major Payne sent to Colonel Summers to tell him to activate the militia, and he tells him to do it quickly. Well, quickly in those days did not happen because there were no telephones, telegraphs, or anything, just horses. And so what happens is Proctor goes back to Haddonfield. That was a day's trip. Gets his men together, and he does not get back by the next day when the British landed. It takes him an extra day. It took an extra day to activate the militia, so there were only a few militiamen there when the British came ashore. Pulaski couldn't get down from Trenton that quickly. And so he got there a day late. So what happens? The British are out at Foxborough, and they are looking at no channels and shallow water. And so they realize they can't get their big ships in. So what they use is their rowboats, if you will. Think of garvies if you're a seashore person. Big garvies that can be rowed. And they row almost 20 miles. But they could only stuff about 500 troops in that particular set of rowboats. So in they come. And if you look at this slide, they come around the Serpentine River. And if you look at the green arrow, you can see where the fort is. As they come down toward the fort, they see cannon, or what they thought were cannon. But they weren't. the cannons had already been sent away up to Red Bank to protect Philadelphia from the British. And so here they are without cannon. So what did they do? They made what they called Quaker cannon, peaceful cannon. They took a pine log, cut the bark off of it, painted it black, and mounted it in the fort wall to make it look like a cannon. Well, it sure faked the British, because the British didn't attack the fort directly. They came just north of the fort where the tip of the green arrow is, right where the Parkway Bridge is today. They disembarked there and they flooded down into this village of 13 buildings, a tavern, a dormitory, and a bunch of storage places. But as they got on land, and as the militia pulled back, because the militia was greatly outnumbered, the British heard that Pulaski was coming from Trenton, that Proctor was coming from Haddonfield, and that Benedict Arnold had sent some troops. And they knew by the next day there would be probably almost 2,000 American militiamen and soldiers surrounding Chestnut Neck. And so the British decided to do their dirty work and be gone. You see, originally they had planned to sail up the Mullica River and destroy the forks and destroy Batstow, where cannonball and cannon were being made. But now they couldn't. So what they did that afternoon is they quickly burned the village to the ground. They realized they couldn't get the ships out of the harbors because they didn't know the channels. And so they burnt their own supply ships. After that, the next morning, they sent some troops over across the Mullica River into what we call New Gretna, and they burned some homes of some people who were loyal to the American cause, destroyed a couple of salt works, and then got back to their ships and took off and got all the way back to the harbor at Foxborough, where they would be safe. At this particular point, the Americans were watching from what we call Leeds Point. If you've ever eaten at the Oyster Creek Inn and looked out over the bay, you were looking from the vantage point of the American militia. And they waited there, and they sent out spies to see when the British would leave. A few of those spies, by the way, were captured. The building's all gone. The ship's all gone. But Chestnut Neck was not all gone, we're going to see. After the battle, the British were gone, and the Americans came back into the village and started to reburn. The ones that were captured were taken up to New York. What were the consequences of Chestnut Neck? One British soldier was shot in the leg. No Americans were wounded. They did what they should have done. They retreated into the bush to avoid the larger British force. And a few were taken captive. Most escaped, but a couple ended up on the Jersey, the prison ship in New York Harbor. How many people were there? That's a hard thing to tell. If you say how many people were there when the British arrived on that late afternoon in October, maybe 100, maybe 150. By the next day, how many people were there? Probably close to 2,000. You had a large portion of the 3rd Battalion was there, about half, which would mean about 200, 250 men. You had the people Proctor brought down with him, that General Benedict Arnold sent, and you had General Pulaski in Burlington County with 800 to 1,000 troops. This that you see on the screen is a company population report done by Captain Zephaniah Steelman, where he had 90 privates under his command that day, 2 sergeants, 2 lieutenants, and himself, the captain. How many men were in the other Patriot companies, the militia companies? We don't know. We have another muster roll, this is called, that reads 30 privates. So a company was somewhere between 30 and 90 privates. Let's split it in half and let's say 60. And let's say there were 6 or 7 companies there by the next day. You had about 400 militiamen. almost all the people who lived in Atlantic County. Now, as we go further, we have also found the receipts in various university libraries in their archives showing where Colonel Summers purchased ammunition, where he purchased meat, where he purchased rum and socks for the soldiers, where he purchased corn. Everything was involved. So what happened after the attack? After the attack was over and the buildings were burned and the British left, the Americans there was nothing they could do there. Some were left behind to start building the towns, but the other were all marched down to Summers Point. Evidently, the Americans got word that Summers Point was also going to be attacked. Why? Because British supply ships that were captured were sold there as well. They went to Summers Point and they built a fort, a mud fort with timbers in it on the waterfront, and we know that that was given cannon right away because a couple of the people in their pension applications remember being able to test fire the cannon with Colonel Proctor and get a cannonball to fly from Summers Point all the way to the beach in Ocean City. That's an amazing shot. I suppose they shot it upwards in an arc, and that was how they did it. A week later, the British are all gone, and Colonel Proctor told Colonel Summers to disband the militia for now and put them back on regular duty, which they did. And so people went back to their fishing jobs, to their farming jobs, to their merchandising jobs. But this is really the bottom line. These privateers had captured so many British ships and put such a dent in the British supply line that London actually ordered the attack. Tremendous attack, but it never came off the way it was supposed to. They spent who knows how much money to burn 13 buildings. The colonialists moved back, let the buildings burn, let the British leave, and then went right back a week later and started rebuilding the buildings. And within a month, those privateer ships, those legalized pirates, if you will, were out the inlet and they were capturing more British ships and continued to do so through 1783 until the end of the war. We've made a list of the people we know were at Chestnut Neck. The only evidence we really have are the pension applications. So you see in front of you a list of the names that we know were there. Were there other people there? Of course, but little by little we're acquiring more names. Second of all, we know that people were hurt, not many. But during the whole course of the war, from 1775 to 1783, there were people killed, 6 of them killed, that were from Atlantic County fighting. Their names are right here. There were people that were wounded there. 8 of them were wounded. And in that day, to be wounded was probably to be crippled the rest of your lives, as their pension applications attest. There were also some that were made prisoners of war. Some escaped. Some were killed in the process of traveling to the prison ship, and some died in the prison ship, and some were exchanged for British soldiers that were captured by the Americans. So what do we have in the end? We have an area that was used to supply Washington's army with food and supplies in times like the winter at Valley Forge or the following winter at Morristown, the winter before at Morristown, or the winter after in the mountains of northern New Jersey. We find that the British tried to disrupt that, but couldn't. What we find is that one county today, with not that many residents, fielded about 400 plus men for the militia, and those militia took on a large British force, and in their own way, acting as patient guerrillas, ended up defeating them and sending them packing back to New York and continued their attacks on the British supply lines. I hope you enjoyed this presentation of the Battle of Chestnut Neck. If you would like more information, you can contact the Atlantic County Historical Society, or you can contact the Colonel Richard Summers chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution, or the General Lafayette chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. It's been great to be with you today. Again, my name is Norm Goss, and I hope you have a wonderful day.